So our first speaker is Tony Lack, and Tony Lack received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. His research interests include phenomenology, the experience of time and temporality, conceptual history, and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. In his scholarly work, he applies these theoretical frameworks to issues in culture, literature, and the arts. He's currently an assistant professor of humanities at Northeast Lakeview College in San Antonio, Texas. And Tony Lack's title of the paper is From Decadent Communities to Flourishing Communities, an outline of a theory.
Okay, thank you. Can I share my screen? I assume I can. All right, I may. And I'm hoping that when I do, you'll be looking at what I'm looking at, which is the title that you just mentioned. Are we okay? All right. And just very briefly, this is not probably going to be a profound work of exegesis because this is part of a much larger project or a larger project, excuse me. It's going to be a book chapter. And the title of the edited collection is Revisiting Classical Theories to Address Contemporary Issues. So it has a lot to do with rethinking or reappropriating ideas, especially from the 19th century social theory, and applying them to contemporary problems. And since it's relatively long, the chapter sketch that I have so far, I've just placed parts of it on these slides, and I apologize for the wordy nature of the slides and some of the long quotes, but what I have here is just kind of the skeleton or the framework of the argument. So what I want to talk about are 4 topics. 2 of them are on this slide. First, I want to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas about decadence and relate them to the concept of community. I'll be drawing mostly from actually from the Twilight of the Idols and maybe a little bit from The Birth of Tragedy, if you're familiar with Nietzsche. I then want to discuss some kind of common problems, historical problems in the interpretation of community and the construction of community as an idea. The first one is community as an antidote to the problems of modernity. Community is often seen as a kind of refuge from modern problems. Then I want to talk a little bit about community as a form of nostalgia and community and the problem of reification. That will take up most of the paper since it's critical theory and the critique is the bulk of it. And then I will talk a little bit about ideas about an ideal community, a community of otherness, affinity, and possibility, rather than maybe what we see oftentimes, a community of identity, inclusion, exclusion, and security. Let's talk about Nietzsche and his ideas about decadence. Nietzsche's ideas on decadence are scattered throughout his work, and they're closely related to all of his other ideas, the idea of nihilism, the will to power, slave morality, resentment, and the will to power, which I repeated, sorry. But what I do want to point out is that Nietzsche's idea of decadence really does differ from our everyday usage, our common usage, where we see decadence in terms of cultural decline or overemphasizing luxury. Think of the decline of Rome, Gibbon's argument, for example, about the decline of Rome. Luxury and pleasure at the expense of duty and discipline, or dissolution, decay, undignified behavior, moral weakness, everything's falling apart, moral relativism and loss of religious faith. The overripeness of a culture that eventually starts to rot. I think that's a fairly common usage of the term decadence, but Nietzsche thinks otherwise. He claims that it's actually serious thinkers, or those who think they're serious thinkers, who sow the seeds of decadence. And in fact, he lays the blame on psychologists and philosophers and priests, especially philosophers and priests, since they were much more common in his era. But we can apply his critique also to social scientists, maybe, psychologists, social workers, and so on and so forth. And so what did Nietzsche say about decadence, or what is it that creates decadence? And here's a long quote, and I'm sorry again, I don't mean to be condescending and read to people. But this is from The Twilight of the Idols. It's the second chapter in The Twilight of the Idols, where Nietzsche addresses the, quote, problem of Socrates. And here we really have the entire idea of the philosopher as someone who creates a problem in order to solve it. And what he says is, in all ages, the wisest have always agreed in their judgment of life, it is no good. At all times and places, the same words have been on their lips, words full of doubt, full of melancholy, full of weariness of life, full of hostility to life. Is it possible that they were, every one of them, a little shaky on their legs, effete, rocky, decadent? Does wisdom perhaps appear on earth after the manner of a crow attracted by a slight smell of carrion? This is a very strong metaphor. And then he goes on to say, ancient Athens was dying out. And we know during the life of Socrates that Athens was starting to see its decline after civil strife and Peloponnesian War and so on. And Socrates understood that the whole world needed him, his means, his remedy, his special artifice for self-preservation. Everywhere the instincts were in a state of anarchy. The same kind of degeneracy was silently preparing itself everywhere. When a man finds it necessary, as Socrates did, to create a tyrant out of reason, there's no small danger that something else wishes to play the tyrant. Reason was then discovered as savior. Neither Socrates nor his patients were at liberty to be rational or not as they pleased. At that time, it was de rigueur. It had become a last shift. Men were in danger. There were only two alternatives, either perish or else be absurdly rational. So you get the gist of it. It's a basic idea that, the doctor needs sick patients. The philosopher needs a society that's become unwise or out of order. And therefore the philosopher focuses on that and begins to create clients, followers who are in some way headed toward decadence or have already become decadent because they are dependent upon the master, whomever that might be, or the teacher or the psychologist to heal them. Okay. It gets worse, and I'm almost sorry for this. I'm not Friedrich Nietzsche, but this is the type of thing that gives Nietzsche the reputation that he has. And what he says is that priests, of course, need sinners. Okay, so, same type of argument. It was the Hebrew priests who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation. Good equals noble equals powerful equals beautiful equals happy equals beloved of God. And here I think he's really talking about the Greeks, especially if you think of Aristotle's ethics. This is really kind of the idea, in Aristotle's ethics, not this formula per se, but the idea that we focus on what's good and becoming better. And to hang on to this inversion with their teeth, the teeth of the most abysmal hatred, the hatred of impotence, saying, the wretched alone are the good, the poor, impotent, lowly alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, alone are blessed by God, blessedness is for them alone. And we can almost hear, some echoes of the Sermon on the Mount here, of course, but he's much harsher, much more cruel. And you, the powerful and the noble, are on the contrary, the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless to all eternity. And you shall be in all eternity the unblessed, accursed, and damned. So here we see the typical inversion, that Nietzsche discusses in the Genealogy of Morals, where resentment turns the world of values upside down in order to modify the playing field so that those who bear this resentment can be in charge. All right. So does Nietzsche offer an argument about this, or does he just, lay out bombastic statements? Well, one of his claims is that the value of life cannot be estimated, and philosophers and priests try to do that. Okay, so he suggests that the creation of values is not based on a rational evaluation or a rational discourse, but instead that values, as he sees them, emerge as symptoms, and of course symptoms of weakness and inability and so on. He says, quote, after all, judgments and valuations of life, whether for or against, cannot be true. Their only value lies in the fact that they are symptoms. They can be considered only as symptoms. Per se, such judgments are nonsense. And then he points out here what he claims is a very simple idea. Sorry. You must therefore endeavor by all means to reach out and try to grasp this astonishingly subtle axiom that the value of life cannot be estimated. A living man cannot do so because he is a contending party, or rather the very object in the dispute, and not a judge, nor can a dead man estimate it for other reasons. For a philosopher to see a problem in the value of life is almost an objection against him, he says in The Twilight of Idols. So this is part of his attack on Socrates. So how can one summarize Nietzsche's approach to decadence? He described cultural belief systems or political movements or artistic genres that emerge from feelings of illness, weakness, pity, suffering. He's in some ways sympathetic to Buddhism, but he's also quite harsh, even to the Buddha, and focusing on suffering so much and generating a religion out of it. And resentment, okay, as sources of decadence. Decadence is a will to death, the will to create norms, standards, values, and systems which limit, trap, and undermine the will to power, which again is this idea that one needs to keep expanding and changing and transcending oneself in order to be fully alive. So anything that limits that or traps that or defines that or reifies that, any professional system generated by a priest or a philosopher is for Nietzsche the source of decadence, because it stalls the will to power. And so again, it's not brought about by a lapse, decadence, or falling away. Instead, it's actively produced by the will to power of those who would improve society by engaging in an active process of recreating standards, policing behaviors, and circumscribing identities. And self-deception is involved. So of course, it becomes very hard to prove empirically. Resentment and the desire for power are actively misrecognized by those who are creating it as a quest for truth, or as manifestations of compassion. And I'm just trying to help you, that kind of idea. So this is what Nietzsche thinks decadence is, and where I want to kind of go with this is to talk a little bit about how the concept of community evolved and changed, and how it kind of starts to approximate what he might be saying, kind of starts to approximate a form of decadence, certain versions of community. So we know the English language word community has its roots in Latin, communitas, which really refers to the spirit of a group of people, okay, who are similar or equal or who share a common purpose. However, that concept, the idea of community, starts to take on a slightly different set of associations in the 19th and 20th centuries. Ferdinand Tönnies, the German, he was a social scientist. Tönnies actually was a scholar of Thomas Hobbes. He wasn't really a traditional sociologist, but he became very important in sociology. And Tönnies used the terms Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, community and society. So we start to see an opposition here to describe different types of social organizations with different types of social ties and connections. And this is, of course, in the transition to modernity. It's the late 19th century, secularization, urbanization, the sort of sacred canopy of belief is starting to fall apart, and we're heading toward the beginning of the 20th century. And sociologists are trying to understand these changes as society becomes more impersonal, more abstract. And so that's what he's calling a Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft then is the homey, warm, sort of folksy community that presumably existed before this big alienating modern society with all its problems was upon us. Durkheim does something very similar. Durkheim, of course, paid more close attention to tribal societies through his nephew, Marcel Mauss. But even Durkheim describes modern societies, and this can be kind of confusing, it always confuses me, in terms of organic solidarity, which means they are highly differentiated organic systems. Okay, we got a time probably warning here. Okay, 2 minutes, all right. And he describes then these traditional societies in terms of mechanical solidarity, okay? So I'm always talking too much. That's why I put this on slides. So I'm going to summarize where I'm headed here. And then if people are interested in the discussion, we can talk about it. Community then emerges as an antidote to modern problems. And if I can get through just this slide, then that will be it for today, I guess. There's a fascination with wholeness, a fascination with healing, a fascination with creating unity. And the main point that I really want to get across is we don't know whether these communities really existed in this ideal form, highly unified, a lot of agreement, a lot of shared belief, a lot of deep, meaningful interaction. Instead, the idea of community really seems to emerge in response to or in opposition to these modern problems. So as Marx discussed alienation, Durkheim discusses anomie or normlessness, a sense of purposelessness in modern life. And Weber's famous phrase, the disenchantment of the world. Modern rationalization brings about this sterile modern society, and community then becomes the antidote. And it starts to become a fictional ideal to which people refer. So I'm sorry I didn't get nearly as far as I wanted, but of course that's my problem, and I don't want to trample on anyone's time. So I'll just stop there, and if people want to know more, we can talk about it later. All right.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, I don't know how that always happens. So, all right.
So the next paper we have is presented by George Kovalenko. George Kovalenko is a PhD student in English and Literary Arts at the University of Denver and holds an MFA in creative writing from New York University. His research interests include poetry and poetics, Frankfurt School critical theory and aesthetics, phenomenology, German literatures, and literary translation. And today, the title of the paper is The Aesthetics of Graven Images in Adorno and Levinas. The floor is yours, George.
Thanks very much. I probably will have a similar problem with time, but so I'll just go right into it. The conclusion of Theodor Adorno's Reason and Revelation calls for an extreme loyalty to the prohibition of images, far beyond what this originally meant. This prohibition in Adorno has an aesthetic as well as a theological dimension. This ban on images, I will argue, is a central constellation in Adorno's aesthetic project in its total injunction against positive representation. The same centrality is found in the peripheral aesthetics of Emmanuel Levinas. For him, the image ban plays the adjacent but divergent role of casting the aesthetic image as always and already an idol, a perpetually immobilized instant of being. Although Levinas and Adorno both theoretically invoke the image ban far beyond what they once originally meant, the injunction in its biblical form already gestures distinctly toward the contours of their respective non-identical applications. The ban appears in Exodus 20, verse 4, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in the heaven above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below." The verse contains two separate injunctions. The first, against the making of pesel, meaning image, idol, sculpture, statue. The second, against the making of temunah, meaning image, likeness, similitude, form. Although Adornian and Levinasian aesthetics are engaged with aspects of both pieces of the ban, I claim that Adorno aligns more intimately with the ban on temunah, Levinas with the ban on pesel. Adorno also more determinedly complicates the spirit of the ban as it relates to an image of nature or natural beauty, and perhaps most crucially, both Adorno and Levinas critically invoke the ban as a ban on an image of anything. Reality and its shadow, Levinas's most explicit work on aesthetics takes issue with the graven image on temporal grounds. Quote, "The statue realizes the paradox of an instant that endures without a future. Its duration is not really an instant. It does not give itself out here as an infinitesimal element of duration, the instant of a flash. It has in its own way a quasi-eternal duration, I am not thinking just of the duration of an artwork itself as an object, of the permanence of writings in libraries or of statues in museums. Within the life, or rather the death of a statue, an instant endures infinitely, end quote. The image introduces the death of each instant into being. It affects its eternal duration in the meanwhile. The image for Levinas is a stopping and ignoring of the flow of time, or rather its delay behind itself. It is what Hent de Vries calls an interruption or cessation of all futurity. The graven image, in its various and already identical formal guises, is always and already idolatrous. Ergo, the work of art, as pestle, statue, image, idol, is always and already a fixed doubling of being. In history, it masquerades as myth, and myth, as the plasticity of history, takes the place of mystery. In this way, the image stands categorically opposed to what in the early Levinas is called the interruption of the encounter with the face of the other. This, which is also reflected in Adorno, is the ground of the ban on images of everything. That is to say, quote, an image is an idol, is to affirm that every image is, in the last analysis, plastic, that every artwork is, in the end, a statue, a stoppage of time, end quote. In its totality, the image returns perpetually to itself. Quote, a work conceived radically is a movement of the same unto the other, which never returns to the same. To the myth of Ulysses returning to Ithaca, we wish to oppose the story of Abraham, who leaves his fatherland forever for an as yet unknown land, end quote. All images, as the already plastic forms of the epic, are nostos made total, a perpetuation of a mythic origin. Against the point of no return, the image is a time without points, pointlessness, pointing to itself. Things, in the fixed time of the image, the time of being in general, are merely to hand. Quote, the characters of a novel are beings that are shut up, end quote. The time of art is the time of pure suffocating being. It is the time of, quote, repetition, the time of destiny, fate, torn away from the temporal flow of the lived world where the future is unknown and where, end quote. For Levinas, the great task of humanity is to strive for justice, always future, always exigent. The image, in making a totality of its instant, is ad perpetuum. It makes the momentary statuesque. What is critical for Levinas is that the image is. In this way, the ban on graven images becomes an injunction against ontological time. On the other hand, for Adorno, the ban serves as a form of negation that might be seen as working dialectically both from without and from within the form of the image. In his analysis of Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron, he writes, quote, Aaron, the man of images and mediation, has to sing the opera, but makes use of language without images. Moses, on the other hand, who represents the principle of the ban on images, does not sing in Schoenberg, but just speaks. The pictorial aspect of music, from which the idea of the non-pictorial work recoiled, is now shifted onto the individual figures, as if the non-pictorial might result from their demise. As if, for the success of such a maneuver is itself a fiction. This as if, intrinsic to the logic of the material and dialectically imposed from without, closes over itself as the impossibility of its own self-annihilation. Here, the ban on images works as a mode of iconoclastic idolatry. Not only is the demise of the pictorial a fiction, but the pictorial itself, in as far as it is, contains a note of its own fictionality. This maneuver, itself a fiction, occurs within a fictional form, not in the everyday understanding of fiction qua verisimilitude or fiction as aesthetic modality, but as precisely this as if, the overtone of an otherwise, fiction contra truth. The ban becomes a ban on images as they are, images as positive representations, as positive forms, as a form of the positive. The as if longs to hurdle the limit of its own fiction, but as a shudder under the spell of itself, comes up against the limit of itself, its formality. Rather than being banned unilaterally from without, the pictorial in Schoenberg's music longs to be free of its form, of its temunah. Informal music, Adorno notes, is a little like Kant's eternal peace. The aim of every artistic utopia today is to make things in ignorance of what they are. In aesthetic theory, he writes that one should make no image, which means no image of anything whatsoever, expresses at the same time that it is impossible to make such an image. Through its duplication in art, what appears in nature is robbed of its being in itself, in which the experience of nature is fulfilled. Art holds true to appearing nature only where it makes landscape present in the expression of its own negativity, end quote. The critical impossibility of image making here as before is cast as an internal as well as external complex. Nature, in its representation, is robbed of its being in itself. As in Levinas, this is true of images of anything. Adorno views the representative term of image making not as a transformation, but as a negation of nature in itself. Sebastian Trukalowski reflects on Adorno's potentially at first surprising alignment of the image band with natural beauty, that Kant, for his part, associates the image band with the sublime rather than the beautiful in nature, whereas Hegel subordinates natural beauty to artistic beauty, the merely real to Geist. However, for Adorno, it is precisely the domination of nature, its abolition, that not only precludes the possibility of the imageless image, but also demands it. Art dominates nature into that which is beyond self-evidence. It stands in for nature through its abolition and effigy. Here, Levinas's ban on the ontological time of the image can be seen, reflected dimly through Adorno, to have a simultaneously inverse effect. Not only does image making subject the instant to the total ontological fixity of endless repetition, but the subject of the representation, that which is before even presentation, is equally subjugated. Nature is relegated through its representation to the ever more dominated image. The instant, by being made into an image, becomes total. The idol stands separate and artificial above nature and subjectivity. For Adorno, the ban on making images qua impossibility is the very impossibility of representation. Here, we might find the ground for a more severe reading of his so oft mangled injunction against poetry after Auschwitz. Invoking Beckett in Negative Dialectics, he writes, quote, "Beckett has given us the only fitting reaction to the situation of the concentration camps, a situation he never calls by name as if it were subject to an image ban," end quote. Represented nature is not represented at all. Rather, as a condition and product of the dialectic of enlightenment, it must, quote, "renounce its claim to know it." The work of art, made primary to nature, stands in for nature precisely where it bears itself as wholly artificial. In other words, the image replaces nature not as sign or allegory, but as a replacement par excellence. Nature evicted from itself as image. The image, as in Levinas, is always and already an idol without signification or illusion. It is not an idol of it as idol is. Thus, for Adorno, the utopian artwork would necessarily have to negate its ofness, the irreconcilability of the pictorial fiction of its as if. It would have to cease to be representative of anything, a ban on images of their determinate negation. Ultimately, in both Adorno and Levinas, the extreme loyalty to the prohibition on images is total. While Adorno prioritizes the work itself, the material, Levinas speaks in terms of its reception or perception, images as extensions of being in general. The prohibition of images in Levinas is an external ban on the ontological time of the graven image, its perpetual idolatry of lifeless life, its being always and already idle. In Adorno, the ban within works and against them comes up dialectically against its own impossibility, its very positive form, the image of longing for reconciliation as imagelessness, form as informality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And that was great timing, actually. That was exactly, I believe, 16 minutes. Our next speaker is Kenneth Lee, And Kenneth Lee is a second-year PhD student in the Comparative Literature Department at University of California, Riverside. His research areas include Chinese, Japanese, and Asian American literatures and their intersections in trans-Pacific and post-colonial studies. And his paper is entitled Walter Benjamin, the Translator as Subject.
Thank you. I just realized when I wrote that up, I was the second year, but I wrote that last year, so I'm third year now. All right, so to share a PowerPoint, is this visible? Okay, cool. All right. Okay. Nowhere in his seminal essays on language and translation does Walter Benjamin explicitly refer to the problem of human subjectivity, but the topic still manifests as a central concern. Benjamin asserts that beyond the instrumental use of language is an expressive use, that language is not merely a mechanical technology, but a natural condition of existence. Thus, Benjamin intimates a connection between his theory of language and the possibility of subjectivity. And to quote, in translation, the original's life achieves its constantly renewed, latest, and most comprehensive unfolding. As the unfolding of a special high form of life, this unfolding is determined by a special high purposefulness. All purposeful phenomena of life, as well as life's purposefulness itself, are in the final analysis purposeful not for life, but for the expression of its essence, for the representation of its significance. Thus, translation ultimately has as its purpose the expression of the most intimate relationships among languages. So notably, Benjamin here doesn't use the term subjectivity, instead he refers to life, and he transitions from the life of a work of art to the life of man, which to him are dually expressed through language. What Benjamin calls the purposefulness of life, the expression of its essence and the representation of its significance, suggests the relationship between subjectivity and language. That is, for him, the possibility of expressing subjectivity lies in language. In this regard, Benjamin preempts Benveniste's theorization that language provides the definition of man. Benveniste writes, "It is in and through language that man constitutes himself as a subject, because language alone establishes the concept of ego in reality, in its reality, which is that of the being." But that conclusion is also incomplete. Both Benveniste and Benjamin surmise that language exists only as the possibility of subjectivity and must be actualized. For Benveniste, actualization is restricted discourse to the instrument of communication that is the individual act of speech. Benjamin takes this concept further, actually, by proposing that all human language and discourse is a product of translation, which becomes the necessary conditional of human subjectivity. Unfortunately, Benjamin doesn't explicitly develop this connection between language and translation to subjectivity, leaving to readers this task of bridging these concepts. And that's the position of this study. By tracing Benjamin's conceptualization of language and translation across his texts, I aim to posit a corresponding theory of subjectivity as Benjamin would have understood it. On language as such, and on the language of man, Benjamin departs from a bourgeois instrumental view of language, in which language communicates objective facts. Instead, Benjamin proposes an object language, broadening the concept of language so that it's not bound in the form of words, but instead inclusive of other articulations like music, sculpture, and technology. Benjamin begins thus to demarcate a distinct mental being and linguistic being. All things have their own language in which they communicate with other things and with human beings, communicating in language their mental being, and through language their linguistic being. In other words, the complete mental being is translated through language so that what is communicated, the linguistic being, comprises only that which is communicable of the mental being. To illustrate this point, Benjamin proposes the example of a lamp. And to quote, "The language of this lamp, for example, communicates not the lamp, for the mental being of the lamp, insofar as it is communicable, is by no means the lamp itself, but the language lamp, the lamp in communication, the lamp in expression. For in language, the situation is this: the linguistic being of all things is their language. Therefore, to Benjamin, everything partakes in the world of language, including objects, which possess a material language through which they communicate to humanity. This object language differs from human language. Benjamin describes this vis-a-vis the principle of sound. In the absence of humanity, the language of things is a material community consisting of physical, practical connections. In contrast, human language creates a magical community in which things are immaterially connected through sound. What Benjamin suggests then is that the object language is a material language that communicates to humanity through sensory perception, through the shared materiality of the object and of the human body. What follows is a process best described as translation. Following the act of reception, the human draws the material language of the object into him or herself, allowing the object to communicate its linguistic being, and then translates the object language into a human language. As demonstrated in Benjamin's example, the lamp's linguistic being is transmitted to a human being through its material presence, and after being translated into the human language, becomes named as a lamp. So this active naming is essentially important, which Benjamin says is, quote, not only the last utterance of language, but also the true call of it. Naming is unique to the language of man and translates the material language of objects into an immaterial and purely mental language. In this realm of pure mentality that belongs to naming, language exhibits intensive and extensive totality. That is, language is both absolutely communicable and universally communicating, and therefore both mental and linguistic. This property of human language, the language of naming, sets humanity apart from nature and establishes human subjectivity. As object communicates themselves to man, man translates their language by naming them, and in so doing communicates himself by naming them. With this in mind, Benjamin poses the question of whether mental being can be described as of linguistic nature, a condition satisfied by the translatory process of naming. Benjamin thus concludes, if a mental being is identical with linguistic being, then a thing, by virtue of its mental being, is a medium of communication. And what is communicated in it is, in accordance with its mediating relationship, precisely this medium, language itself. Language is thus the mental being of things. In other words, language communicates itself. It's in language and in its property of naming or of translation that subjectivity arises. Thus, we may conclude that for Benjamin, human subjectivity is founded on the act of translation. Translation is subjectivity, and thus the translator is subject. Having reached a comfortable synthesis of language, translation, and subjectivity, we could end that here, but Benjamin isn't satisfied with that definition of human language. He goes on to claim that human language is flawed, and the described act of naming, through which the mental being of man should communicate itself to God, has fallen. Thus, he begins to take on a theological approach to confront the limitations of human language and re-examines the subject that he's proposed. Language and translation, as described thus far, is or was the paradisiacal state of things prior to the fall. Going on to contrast the limitations of human language with the divine ideal of God's creative word, Benjamin describes in language a conflict between the expressible and the inexpressible, and consequently an unconscious judgment in language. All of that, according to Benjamin, stems from the original sin, that of Eve taken from the tree of knowledge. I'll skip this quote for time. And according to Benjamin, good and evil abandons name. Good and evil coming from knowledge acquired from the tree of knowledge. These are concepts that to him become alienated from what he calls a pure mental being. So in this sense, language no longer communicates only itself. Instead, it begins to communicate judgment. From judgment comes the communication of abstraction as well, of unknowability, undecidability, and therein lays the foundation for linguistic confusion. If we consider Benveniste's theory of pronouns, this might also clarify Benjamin's distinction of the ideal immediate knowability of the proper name from the reality of an alienated abstract language. Benveniste, like Benjamin, observes that man's instrument of communication is not language per se, but discourse, or, quote, language put into action and necessarily between partners, end quote. In discourse, I-you forms a polarity constituting the first and second person pronouns. This polarity has unique meaning in relation to, but no further than, the present instance of discourse. Thus, we may define I as the person who states I in the present instance, and you as the person spoken to as you in the present instance, but the I-you polarity is defined only in terms of locution and not of objects. They do not refer to any objective positions in reality. Benveniste thus concludes that human language is not a signal system, but instead a system of discourse that requires constant interpretation, constant instances where the speaker positions himself as subject by referring to himself as I, and posits another person as wholly exterior and therefore object by referring to him or her as you. Benveniste clarifies also that this polarity, which is a fundamental condition in language, doesn't mean equality or symmetry, because ego always has a position of transcendence with regard to you. Furthermore, the first and second person are vantage points only made possible by the observation of a real or imagined conditional third person, a non-person that acts as the voice of denotation. And these are instances of the unconscious judgment that Benjamin describes as linguistic confusion. Pronouns therefore represent the movement of language away from the concrete, that being the characteristic of the proper name, and instead toward the abstract. I and you are terms of intrinsic judgment, while the third person, he, she, it, allows discourse to persist beyond the present instance, and therefore requiring reinterpretation, thereby introducing unknowability and abstraction. So from this discussion, an extrapolation might be made to refine the theory of subjectivity that's implied by Benjamin. Benjamin criticizes linguistic judgment, and that is clarified by Benveniste as the positioning of I as the interior subject and you as an exterior object. We might therefore conclude that subjectivity for Benjamin did not necessitate an oppositional relationship to objectivity. This interpretation is also aligned with Benjamin's conceptualization of language, not as unique to humanity, but as a property of all things. Possessing language, all things contain their own subjectivity, that of material language, and communicate it as such to humanity, whereupon their subjectivity is translated into human language. It is conditional of human subjectivity to perform the act of naming, to translate. But what is being translated is not object, insofar as it is not exterior, because in order to translate, man must take the thing's material subjectivity into himself. Interiority and exteriority are conceptual boundaries that, for Benjamin, do not exist outside of flawed linguistic construction. It is the fault of a flawed human language, then, that human subjectivity has taken the form of opposition. Unlike theories of subjectivity that propose the discursive formation of subjectivity, Benjamin suggests that rather than being constructed by opposition to objectivity, human subjectivity is constructed from objects. As such, human subjectivity can be conceived as a dialectical relationship between interior and exterior, between man and thing, brought to synthesis by translation. So far we've limited our discussion of translation to the translation of object language to human language, but Benjamin also considers translation in relation to the multiplicity of human languages, facilitating a closer inspection of human subjectivity. And on language, Benjamin writes that in contrast to the paradisiacal language of perfect knowledge that existed prior to the fall, human language is now, quote, infinitely differentiated in the multiplicity of language. But he also acknowledges that a return to a concrete language is impossible, and furthermore, that there cannot or can no longer be a single perfect human language. He doesn't advocate for monolingualism. In the translator's task, he contends instead that translation is the means by which humanity can most closely return to the original condition, that being a unified pure language. To develop a more comprehensive theory of translation, he begins with the premise on language that language is not simply instrumental, but expressive. This assertion informs Benjamin's claim that the primary intention of art is not to communicate with any particular audience, hence the ineffectuality of translation that seeks only to retransmit a message. Instead, Benjamin tells us a translation is itself a form of art concerned with the realm of language, and language is necessarily the realm of the mental being and of human subjectivity. So according to Benjamin, all human languages share a primordial relationship, whether in linguistic terms as fundamental expression of the communicable mental entity, or in theological terms as offshoots from the original language of man. Regardless, all human languages are related in that they represent the possibility of subjectivity, but their imperfect nature precludes the pure mental being. And let's see. This is 2 minutes, so I'm gonna skip ahead here. I want to just conclude by talking about Benjamin's connection with Derrida, because his theory of language and translation has a very interesting intersection with Derrida's criticism of phonocentrism, right? Derrida asserts that phonocentrism is an expression of Western philosophical logocentrism, that is the separation of logos from an irreducible and external reality, and he talks about the binary opposition of speech and writing, phonocentrism, being a form of that. In previous examination, we've already demonstrated that Benjamin rejects this logocentric conceptualization, right? He forgoes an oppositional conceptualization of human subjectivity in favor of the synthetical, but he does exhibit phonocentrism. He describes sound as the pure principle that translates materiality, and he therefore participates in this phonocentric tradition, suggesting that the primary form of human language is speech, and that writing is an imitation of human language. What's interesting, though, is that if translation is subjectivity, then subjectivity must exist within the realm of translation, that is the space between languages, and therefore can only be attained as the sign of a signified language. So in lieu of a traditional logocentric position of treating reality as an external point of reference, Benjamin conceives of language as being external and irreducible. And yeah, I'll conclude it there.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Last but not least, we have Jennifer Kavanagh. Jennifer Kavanagh is a short story writer with an interest in place, isolation, and the uncanny. Her story Office Space is published by Fairlight Books, and her stories, The Daughter and First Snow, will be published in the upcoming editions of Anthropod and Progenitor. She's a lecturer and postgraduate researcher at Liverpool John Moores University. And Jennifer Kavanagh will present her paper entitled Memory, a Light He Remembered Was Fleeting.
Hi, thanks. I'm going to try and just share my screen if that's okay. So, but I don't know if it's going to work. So, see. Okay, is that okay? Hi. So, no text is created in a void. It is directly influenced by the space in which it's written. This paper discusses how the symbiotic relationship between space and memory affects how a writer reacts to and writes in a space. My current research, which is a PhD I've been doing, concerns the impact on the writer of the physical writing space. It takes the form of a short story collection, different stages of which were written in different writing spaces, and a reflective analysis or exegesis, and considering the process of its creation. I use the term writing space to refer to any space in which writing takes place, and such spaces fall into two categories: contained, meaning the writer's immediate environment, such as a room or garden, and geographical space, referring to the larger vicinity, such as a country or city. The writing process is broken down into the three stages: pre-writing, so inspiration, musing, and note-taking; first writing, meaning pen to paper or fingers to keyboard writing; and redrafting. Underlying factors determine how the writer responds to a space. These factors affect and depend on the writer's familiarity with, sense of belonging in, or feeling of being other to the space. Depending on the writer's relationship with the space, she either uses the writing process to make it more familiar and herself belong in it, or the writing produced reflects the difficulties in doing so. Early on in my research, I noticed that memory is featured frequently in the free writing with which I typically started each writing session, as well as appearing in my pre-writing and first writing. This was true no matter what the nature of the space or my relationship with it. Sometimes the connection between memory, writing space, and writing was immediately apparent, but on other occasions, reflection and analysis was required to uncover the link. One of the short stories in my collection, Wednesday, describes a woman's journey to meet an estranged childhood friend, during which their friendship and reasons for the estrangement are revealed through flashback. One of the contained spaces of this story was a cafe in Southport, a seaside town in the northwest of England. where I am now, actually. And in this space, I wrote a section in which the narrator reminisces about clubbing with friends as a teenager, and the setting described is similar to the clubs I went to at the same age. Memories are surfaced while free writing in the cafe. I'm not going to read it, but I'll just put that up. On the surface, the writing space of the cafe has little in common with either the remembered space nor the story space, the cafe being small, very bright, and half full of customers aged 40 and above. However, both cafe and club are social spaces. I was writing alone in the cafe, but there were conversations happening around me. And while there is no dialogue in this section of the story, the narrator's memory of socializing with friends contrasts with the majority of the story in which she is solitary. The atmosphere of the writing space, therefore, evoked memories of spaces with similar atmospheres. In the Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard states that all inhabited spaces contain the essence of the notion of home. Whenever I used a writing space during my research, I was inhabiting that space, whether that was for a couple of months or a few hours. The space then became one which bore the essence of the notion of home, as I tried to make a home for myself and my writing. Each time a space was unfamiliar to me or I lacked a sense of belonging in it, I both consciously and unconsciously tried to rectify this situation and make myself feel more comfortable in it by, for example, establishing a routine. Whenever I did so, I was increasing the homeliness of the space to me. In exploring the connection between space, memory, and imagination, Bachelard explains that the sense of home and comfort one feels within a space is augmented both by imagination and by reliving memories of protection. The function of the imagination is to increase the homeliness of a space. It's unintentional and unconscious. In using a space as a writing space during my research, I was also using imagination intentionally. It therefore follows that inhabiting a space in order to write should make it even more of a home to the writer than when not writing, as the imagination is working both consciously and unconsciously. If imagination does emphasize the protective and homely nature of a space, the very act of using it consciously to write a short story would make that space more of a home. This also provides an explanation for the prevalence of memory in my collection, memory being one way in which the imagination acted unconsciously to augment my sense of connection and home. Even negative memories can enhance the writer's relationship with the space because negativity is still connection. An empty shell generates daydreams of refuge, and each writing space used in my research was an empty shell, entered with the intention of filling with narrative. The memories surfaced were daydreams of refuge made safe by their being known and completed events, providing a refuge from uncertainty and unfamiliarity. Okay. My research is phenomenological, as it concerns my interpretation of the effects of writing spaces on me as a writer and is an interpretive study of human experience. Bachelard theorizes that when a phenomenologist is in a new home, memory and imagination are closely linked as she seeks to uncover the space's original shell. In allowing myself to be influenced by the space and interpreting this in my writing, I have been using imagination to uncover the original shell or essence of each space. This uncovering was unconscious, even though I was consciously allowing it to happen. The memories of clubbing in my free writing represent this uncovering. I was influenced by the original shell rather than the more obvious features of the cafe. In considering the effects of each space on my writing, I have also been consciously uncovering this original shell by drilling down to analyze which part of the essence of each space has created particular effects on myself and my writing. In the case of the cafe, it was the atmosphere that was the essence of the space and that which gave it its sense of homeliness and connection to me. This was represented in the memories that surfaced. When writing Wednesday, I knew the narrator would have flashbacks to her relationship with her former friend, stimulated by walking past places of significance to their friendship. She walks from South Liverpool to the Royal Court Theatre in the city centre, so I did the same several times. I wanted to use my memories as material for interpretation and to reconstruct them into the narrative, to use the spaces that I encountered in my description of setting, but also to stimulate the remembering of emotions, atmospheres, and events for use within the story. This was an exercise in memory work, taking an inquiring attitude towards the past and its reconstruction through memory, and taking what is remembered as material for interpretation. As I was also acting as a flaneur, walking the streets in the heart of the multitude and away from home. Each walk was an exercise in pre-writing in which I made observations and took notes on memories and the appearance of spaces. While these notes did prove beneficial in describing setting in the story, even those spaces on this journey with which I did have a prior connection did not stir memories that fitted with the narrative. There are three explanations for this. Firstly, I wanted the narrator's flashbacks to be negative, but my memories of those spaces were positive. Secondly, whereas on other occasions, unfamiliar writing spaces and those in which I lacked a sense of belonging encouraged memories in order to strengthen my connection with the space. When just walking through spaces not known to me, there was little time to encourage such memories. Therefore, it was unnecessary for my unconscious mind to strengthen my relationship with these spaces to make me feel more comfortable. Thirdly, any connection I did have with the writing places past which I was walking was now distant. Not only was I much older than when those spaces were important to me, but I was also approaching them as a writer. There was too much of a disconnect and no real need for the unconscious mind to make me feel comfortable in them and provide daydreams of refuge. My overt keenness to inspire memories perhaps even formed another barrier. I did, however, take some other walks, which were both familiar and of importance to me. One of these was along the South Bank in London, London being the city where I've lived most of my adult life, but from which my research dictated that I spend a lot of time away, my research and now the pandemic. I have made the journey from London Bridge Station to the Royal Festival Hall on countless occasions, and it includes several spaces en route with which I have connections and which evoke memories. The route goes past Southwark Cathedral, the Tate Modern, the National Theatre, and the National Film Theatre. Landmarks with which I've visited on several occasions and also used as writing spaces. I took these research walks while consciously thinking about the spaces around me, pre-writing, free writing, and first writing. As I was frequently away from London during the course of my research and the pandemic, I was prevented from taking this walk as often as I have in the past. Therefore, when I did make the journey, though it felt familiar to me, it also generated feelings of nostalgia, loss, and separation. This mood, but not the particulars of those settings, was transferred to Wednesday, as well as to another story in the collection, Instasizing. This is another story with a non-linear narrative in which a woman, Steph, struggles with her perceived entrapment in an office job while living vicariously through the Instagram post to her friend Lee, who has managed to escape and go travelling. In one of these contained spaces, the Tate Modern, I used both the gallery itself as well as the Granville Bozeman members' room on the 8th floor of the Blavatnik building. One side of the members' room faces the NEO Bankside apartment building, the floor-to-ceiling windows of which allowed Tate members to look directly into the residents' homes. This resulted in two particular effects on my writing. I had already written some of what would become the description of Lee's Instagram posts. However, this influenced my choice to have the protagonist use this as a kind of voyeurism. She looks on the life of her friend, which on one level seems very close to her, separated only by a screen, in the same way that the Tate members appear to be only meters away from the lives of the NEO residents. I've got a picture. So on the right, that's the Blavatnik building, and the viewing platform looks right into those apartments there that are very expensive, and there's been a big court case. In the same way that there is both a frightening drop and a huge status gap between the public gallery visitors and the owners of the multi-million-pound properties, there is a huge geographical difference between Lee and Steph, as well as a difference in their statuses within their friendship. Yet the distance between Steph and Lee is also a reflection of the distance created by time and memory. I was reminded of visits I'd made to the gallery with friends, but I was now using the space to work, while they were also working, but in different spaces. These were, once more, daydreams of refuge, while also representing the difference between these two parts of my life. The visitors of the gallery looked directly into the Enyo apartments, but I noticed that some of the residents have chosen to direct their furniture towards the inside, away from the prying eyes of the tourists. The impact of this on my writing can be found in Steph's inward-looking nature, as she lives vicariously through others' lives, both online and through the television. She experiences envy and regret, but it's her choice to look inwards instead of outwards. Looking at these apartments also served as a reminder of Bachelard's empty shell, an essence of the notion of home. The glass and the apartment's openness make them seem less cosy from the outside, and one would imagine that the inhabitants have chosen to live there in order to look out at the world rather than inwards at the cozy shell of home. Yet even they, in turning their furniture inwards, have tried to create protection for themselves and for their notion of home. In the same way, Steph, in instasizing, may try to convince herself she wants to look out at the world, but she ultimately feels safer and more at home looking inwards at what she knows. To conclude, in a writing space, memory is a vital tool with which the imagination can find refuge, protection, and the essence of the notion of home. In my research, memories reflect and combat the themes of familiarity, belonging, and isolation, as well as representing separation and the need for or loss of the idea of home. No text is created in a void, as memory will always fill it. Thank you. And that's just my notes. So, okay.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to. Sorry.
Well, thank you everybody for your lovely papers. We already have a great question. So by Chris Rafferty, if they are here, would you mind actually starting us off?
Yeah, hi. I was really interested in Dr. Lack's talk when he mentioned Socrates and community, because that kind of intersected with my research. So I wrote it out there, and I guess I'll just read it because otherwise I could just go on a tangent. I'm interested in Dr. Lack's Socrates reference, especially the community solution for a destabilized society. I was wondering if you could tell me what strata of society is Socrates seeking to make stable? You know, the whole Hobbesian limit and privilege thing. His separation of worker and laborer makes me wonder if he also separates who deserves to be stable, as in, well, like I said, the Hobbesian thing. And the connection immediately came to me. Also, did your research reveal any of Socrates' community solution to current global unrest? Can you see how maybe it might be, you know, applicable now? Because, you know, back then it was worse than it is now.
Yeah, thanks. And this paper is a book chapter. I don't know if you were with us from the very beginning, but there's some really large leaps in it. So just to clarify a couple things before I try to answer your interesting question. I started out with Nietzsche's idea of decadence, and Socrates is used there by Nietzsche as an example of someone who's creating decadence by finding a problem in order to provide a solution. And so that's, you know, really what I was talking about there. And then from there, the chapter will go on to discuss community as a solution to the problem of modernity, the unrest and the unsettling, the jarring changes taking place around the late 19th, around the Industrial Revolution to about World War I. Community then becomes kind of fetishized as a privileged place. And then, you know, what's in the back of my mind, of course, is today's ideal of community as a safe space, as a sanctuary, and so on. And I'll lay my critical cards on the table. I think it's becoming kind of like a tribal notion, a kind of an exclusive notion, you know, stay out of our community and we're all victims and we need protection and so on. So pardon me for being so blunt, but that's the gist of the, you know, the idea that I'm getting at here. But Socrates, I'm not sure how much you know about that golden age of Athens, but Athens is starting to unravel during the life of Socrates after Pericles and after the battle at Marathon and the Persian War and so on. Athens becomes preeminent, but then very quickly they get defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, and Socrates fights in that war as an Athenian. And he's seeing this happening all around him. And he also starts to associate with Plato, who is even more conservative than Socrates in trying to establish order. So in a nutshell, and then, maybe you can rebound back to me here. I don't think Socrates was seeking any community solutions or trying to find any particular aspect of the community. For Socrates, if we want to talk about the problem is desire and passion and unreason and unrest, which he indeed does associate with democracy, and he associates it with the many, quote unquote. Socrates is always looking for a singular definition, or he's always looking for an expert who has a techne to give him a rule, for living and so on and so forth. But as for a class strata, I'm not too sure. I think Socrates, might be satisfied with something like the hoi polloi, at least in the dialogues that I've read, the many, those who cannot control their passions, would be those who need to master themselves, but not to be mastered by a community. I think later on, it's Plato, of course, who creates this, monstrous republic where certain strata of society, based upon their passions and their desires and their loves, those who are full of appetite and those who are full of honor and those who are full of reason, they find their place in the so-called republic. But Socrates was not as much of an enemy of democracy as Plato, but he certainly did think that one of the major problems was an unruly mind driven by passion and the idea of doxa, or public opinion, that had to be controlled. I don't know if that, helps.
Yeah, that's the exact opposite of what I was hoping you were going to say.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, he isn't the only structure, I think, for Socrates. I see him as kind of an individualist, and not really searching for a structure, if that's what we're getting at here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm at a place right now where it's like I'm trying to find someone, philosopher or theorist, that has addressed how the necessity for that hoi polloi, and not the hoi polloi, the masses that you were talking about that Socrates thinks had to be controlled. That's you, that's me.
Right. Have you looked at the work of Axel Honneth, Honnethe?
You put that in the chat so I don't miss that.
Yeah, Axel Honneth. He's a student of Jürgen Habermas, and Honneth he's developing Hegelian ideas about. I'm sorry, I guess I sent it to just Nazi. I apologize. I'll try to send it to everyone, but it's Honneth, and the book is called "The Struggle for Recognition," and he uses Hegel. And Hegel, of course, is countering many of Hobbes's ideas. And so if you want to, I'll send my email as well, and I can send you some more resources. But I think the gist of what you're looking for is maybe found in Honneth. There's the idea of the development of intersubjective solidarity from the ground up through the process of struggling over the recognition of identities, which is a Hegelian idea. I'll stop rambling, but you might find something.
Yeah, right now I'm at Viet Thanh Nguyen. Have you read any of his memory representation work? That's kind of where I'm at. And also Yuval Noah Harari, you want to know truth, you go to, look where the suffering is. That's kind of where I've landed. I'm just wondering that, they got there by reading somebody. So I want to know who they're reading.
I don't know, but a lot of the neo-Hegelian stuff focuses on a dialectic of emerging solidarity and unity that comes out of struggle. And so if you email me, I can send you some sources, and they might take you in the wrong direction. But these are anti-Hobbesian ideas. There's no doubt about that. Anti-Hobbesian ideas.
Thank you so much. I really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Thank you. Any other questions for our wonderful panelists? Yes, go ahead.
Sure. So I'll put this in the chat as well, just in case. But yeah, so I have a question for Kenneth. In my own research, I'm really fascinated by both Marxist criticism and deconstruction. So I'm really just starting in all those things, and I'm intrigued by this notion that Benjamin wrote about things that we might consider structural or post-structural with linguistics. So considering these things, do you find Benjamin's work with linguistics fitting in with any groups or schools in this theory, or do you think he's someone who strikes out on his own? I noticed that you connected him to Derrida towards the end, but I didn't know if he had a place in that or if he's really just kind of different. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Benjamin does strike me as odd because I suppose I would go with your third option, that he's sort of just out there, right?
Sure, yeah.
He almost has two very opposing views within his own work, that at the same time, language it functions as its own sort of like irreducible reality, but then he also talks about language as being differentiated from a perfect language of knowledge, thus suggesting, right, that language has its own kind of socio-cultural unconscious that's associated with, I guess, whichever people, quote unquote, whichever community speaks that language. So in a strange way, yeah, he is both a little structuralist and a little post-structuralist. I think something that might interest you is to look into Naoki Sakai's work, which bounces off a lot of Benjamin's ideas while sort of diverging a little bit in this regard, because where Benjamin almost sort of suggests a kind of, idea of language that is very much almost worryingly essentialist, Sakai sort of begins to subvert that, and in that way is much more post-structuralist.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can put that in the chat as well.
Sure, thank you.
The floor is open, and
I have a follow-up question for Kenneth. I wonder if, and thanks everyone for the talks, it was really a pleasure to be a part of. I wonder, in this sort of way you've situated the question of the language of man in relation, first of all, historically to the sort of prelapsarian language, but in its sort of potential as having this, as containing in it the sort of potential of subjectivity, which it seemed like you see as sort of either unilateral or central. And I wonder if you find that there are other possibilities in language that you see mediating that. By mediating it, I don't necessarily mean to suggest that in Benjamin this possibility is sort of like imminently present, right, immediately redeemable, but rather if you see other sort of strata or inflections or textures in the conception of language, especially in those two essays, that are working alongside or in mediation with the idea of the potential of subjectivity.
Yeah, so the way Benjamin describes language in those two texts is actually very similar to the way he describes criticism as well. I don't quite recall the text, but he talks about criticism, the process of criticism, as a process of multiple reflections in which the critic begins to encompass the thing that he or she is critiquing. So in that sense, critique is a process of translation. You encompass the thing, you translate it again into criticism. So I'm not totally sure if that's answering your question, but Benjamin also thinks of, I guess, this process of translation as being not only subjectivity, but also criticism. And in that way, you might also sort of make that connection that criticism is subjectivity as well.
Can I ask, what kind of theory of the subject are you perhaps working with here, or are some of these authors working with? And I'll be very, very brief, but if you think about Kant's basic idea, that there's a framework of apperception, a sort of structure, in the mind that allows us to not only apprehend the objects in the world, but also to associate them, connect them, make sense of them, and then articulate them and talk about them. We have a subject that's already, to some extent, has something there. There's already, not being constituted by language, but always has the ability to decipher the world and to make associations, to posit, to do all these things, to denote, to connote, and so on and so forth. Chomsky, something like that, working with this idea of the mind or the subject as already containing this language instinct and this ability. The world out there then, of course, is incredibly complex, and there are all these associations, but the subject can then make sense of it and do all these things that you were describing, because the subject already contains the ability to do these things. A lot of the theories that are post-Kantian theories, they either stress the structure, like structuralism, semiotics, and so on, even maybe Heidegger, or they stress subjectivity, but this space in between is kind of left open to emerge. So does Benjamin himself talk at all about the capacity or the ability of the mind? Or where does the ability to speak come from in him? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I mean, I hope you understand what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
But, if we're an empty vessel and we learn these words, then there's a hell of a lot that we have to learn in order to speak and utter. But instead, if we come with the ability to associate these terms already in our mind, then there's much less that one needs to do, and one can do all the things that you were suggesting with language. And it can be all those things.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I don't necessarily have the answer.
Sure.
But I would probably make the guess that, not even just from reading Benjamin, it seems that he would sort of go with the idea that that language is very much innate. And Benveniste likewise suggests that language is no longer divorceable from humanity. But at the same time, though, it seems that for Benjamin, it almost seems like human language isn't really necessary. While it's innate, there's like a sort of more primordial object language that to him seems to supersede it. And that human language is really just a technology that we've created, and that maybe has since become innate, but was primarily for this purpose of just being able to differentiate ourselves from other objects.
Do you know about Graham Harmon's work, Object-Oriented Ontology? He's over at UCLA. It's called Object-Oriented Ontology. And his name is Harmon. He's at UCLA.
Okay.
He's a phenomenologist, and so sounds like some of what you're saying connects with his work.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds good.
This is not fully formed, but following you, Tony, I was thinking about plugging in transcendental imagination between object language and human language, and as Kant describes what transcendental imagination is.
Yeah, absolutely. The understanding and the imagination both working together to produce that effect. Yeah, and I mean, all I was really trying to suggest is that there has to be some kind of mediating structure that already exists that can then emerge and develop. Yeah, I mean, and we could see Hegel and Heidegger both as taking that Kantian structure and putting it out into the world, so to speak. But there's something missing from bare mind that
I would say I think that's right, but I think for Benjamin specifically, that sort of Hegelian understanding of early in the phenomenology, that there is the twist on the Kantian subject being subject as medium, yeah, and then that becoming always and already, but we have to talk about this some way, yeah. So historically contingent, which then is he's reading, of course, very much through Marx.
Right.
But I think my understanding is that the sort of explicit theory of the subject is absent in Benjamin, because he takes the sort of the Marxian inversion of Hegel as sort of demanding that any theory of the subject be necessarily historically mediated. So any pure theory of subject becomes sort of, I suppose, dialectically redundant.
Yeah, and Marx has such an emphasis on praxis as opposed to poesis, for example, as opposed to bringing forth and creating. And, you know, maybe that's in some way what Benjamin is picking up, this idea of the action and the practical activity rather than what makes it possible. Although, I mean, Marx still has a sense of human nature, I think, as rational and expressive, as wanting to externalize what's internal through practice. Yeah, but anyway.
Oh, I had a quick question for Jennifer as well, actually, if we still have time for questions.
Oh, of course we have. I don't know if the Zoom is going to stop on its own, but we do have time.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, Jennifer, thank you for your talk. And I'm really fascinated with this connection between physical space and literature. I've worked with prison literature, Japanese American internment, for instance, and I've noticed that scholarship tends to read these works as protest. And I'm curious if there are alternative potentialities for those kinds of spaces, for spaces of confinement. Whether you have any insight about this, or what Bachelard might suggest about the prison space.
That's not an area I've looked at, but now I'm kind of I've kind of come to the end of things. I'm kind of, it might be something that I do kind of an area that I do look into, because my research is more, it was basically over like the course of, it was like sort of 3-4 years. I went to, there lots of different like spaces and spaces where it was my own experience, and just sort of how I didn't sort of enter the spaces with any kind of idea what I was going to write, or the genre, or any kind of idea of the content or theme, and just allowed the different spaces to influence me. But one of the things now, I suppose, is more perhaps looking at something like that, because there's a lot of work just about sort of writers and their writing spaces, and where people like to work. So I'm not interested in that sort of area as such. Well, it's interesting, but it's not kind of where I want to go. But and then there's very, very famous works like sort of Ulysses about the Dubliners, about these very specific places, and but it's maybe a city or a town, but perhaps looking at something like that. So these kind of spaces with things in common, perhaps that could be something that I'd be interested in looking at, I think. Thank you. Don't know if I really answered the question, but
no. Thank you.
I had a follow-up for Jennifer. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say we have time for one more question. But go ahead, George.
I was just curious. I was really struck by the sort of your kind of conclusive gamut about the buildings across the street from the Tate, the apartment buildings. And I think as a sort of, I found it interesting that it became, because of sort of the way you couch that, as a way of understanding the process of writing. And I wonder if you see the question of receiving a text rather than creating a text, i.e. the process of reading, as having a similar kind of inflection, that there's this sort of looking in quality to it with all the nuances that you presented there, or if you see the process of receiving a text, reading a text as having a kind of different mechanism.
Well, I mean, well, I suppose we all where you I suppose where you are emotionally and even physically when you read something or watch something or anything, it does, you know, it does affect how you perceive it. And obviously, you know, there's lots of stories and novels and films where people, you know, say that, oh no, you need to have done X, Y, and Z beforehand to really appreciate it. But that's not to say that someone isn't appreciating that in their own way, and there's no better or worse way. So yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely, you know, there are similarities because they're both subjective. That's, you know, that there was no subjectivity in, you know, how we interpret text, like none of us would kind of be here, you know, just sort of it's all, yeah, I think there is. I mean, it was like it was specifically, my research was specifically, you know, writing and then thinking, okay, well, why did this happen in this way here and whatever. But yeah, I can definitely see a connection between the two. Okay.
Well, just want to thank the panelists once again. Thank you. But we also have a business kind of thing to do. The critical theory panel is a recurrent panel, and historically, traditionally, the chair asks the panelists if any of them would like to chair the next year's critical theory panel. This is how I got to chair it. I presented the previous conference, so no pressure. But yeah, if anybody would like to, please email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and I will forward your name to Craig. And oh, sorry, Sam, I think maybe.
I was just going to say thank you, so you're good. Don't worry.
Well, yeah, have a great day. Have a great rest of conference, and see you in the digital world, maybe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.